It is my absolute delight and honor to introduce today's panel. The biographies are written for you in the program for the day, but I'd like to introduce sort of what the question is, what we're trying to get at here today in this panel. Official statistical offices and government departments have been gathering data about the economy, about police and crime, from the census to the courts and the schools and hospitals, and they analyze terabytes of data every single day. The modern policymaker, when it comes to data, has never had it so good. And yet, it's not entirely obvious to me, or indeed, I think sometimes to the general public, that this wealth of data has actually led to the desired outcome of improved policy that generates better well-being, reduces inequality, enhances productivity, and all of those good things we might want to come from it. And so in order to try and drill down into why that might be the case, we've brought together some of the greatest experts that we could think of. So we have Sarah O'Connor and Joe Swinson with us, and Sir Ian Diamond is on his way. He will join us in just a few moments. So I think what I would like to do is come to you first, Joe. Now, you have worked in government. You've been in policy. You were a minister in the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. You are a visiting professor at the University of Cranfield. And you are director for Partners for a New Economy. So you have experience, direct first-hand experience across policy, the business sector, and the research and academic sector. And what I'd like to ask you to start with, hello. This is also my approach to all things in life. I'm always at the last minute. What I'd like to start with is, of these three sectors, policy, business, and research, which do you think is doing the best in terms of turning data and information into improved outcomes?
Yeah. Well, I suppose, I mean, they all have their advantages and the areas that they're able to use data in well or otherwise, but also their own constraints. So, I mean, I think if you look at academic research, you get amazing information and data and analysis and recommendations and ideas that flow in places like here in Cambridge and many other parts of the country and globally. But you have a greater distance from the levers of power to actually do something about it. And there's no doubt that research can absolutely make a big difference, but there is that translation mechanism that you need. That research needs to be seen, needs to be understood, then needs to be taken seriously and translated into action. So I think the constraints on the research and academic community is more about how do you make it tangible? How do you turn it into something that is used? Whereas in the policymaking community and in a different way in the business community, the decisions that are being made are informed by data, yes, but it's not as simple as saying, this is what the data says, and so this is what we will do, because you have other constraints that you're having to consider. In the case of business, then obviously what the shareholders are considering and that kind of pressure from investors. And in a political sense, then you have a myriad of different issues that you have to be thinking about. And what I would say in policy terms is there's also a kind of level. So at a kind of granular technocratic level, when you're trying to, crunch the numbers on, a particular area of something which actually policy officials within a government department can get on and do, and it doesn't have a huge kind of political focus on it, then actually being led by the data is fairly straightforward. But when it's something which is a political issue, then we don't really largely get led by the data, and that is a big part of the problem that we're facing. And so you can see that when it comes to all sorts of different issues, perhaps most obviously the commitments that were being talked about earlier in terms of net zero. The climate science is incredibly clear about what needs to happen, and the political will to make those things happen is not yet evident to the extent that is required in any society that I've seen around the world. And so the question then becomes one of political will. And I mean, what I would say, so in my current role, we are a funder collaborative, and we make grants to organizations that are trying to transform the way the economic system works, particularly from an environmental perspective. And some of the areas where we've seen the greatest progress have been institutions that have a public purpose and are able to be led by the science and the data, but are perhaps just one step removed from those direct pressures and constraints of political accountability. So a couple of examples would be the central banks, where, you know, in the last 5 years, there's been a huge progress in the taking seriously of sustainability, the understanding of that systemic risk to the whole financial system. You've had the setting up of the network for greening the financial system. It's now got more than 100 central banks and regulators in it. You've had the change to the Bank of England mandate, the European Central Bank strategy. So really quite significant progress in a short space of time. But these are institutions that have the public interest at heart. And yes, they have to, you know, navigate the politics of finance ministries, but they also have a fair bit of freedom to be guided by what the evidence actually says. And then the other place that I would say is in a similar situation is actually the European Commission, which again is just that one step removed. Yes, national governments obviously are a constraining factor, but perhaps a little bit more freedom when they are putting together the Fit for 55 package and really trying to take a leadership role and have debates that are very much broader about what kind of economy we want. So, yeah, you've got lots of constraints on different actors, and in a sense, it's how do you translate what the data says into what becomes possible to actually make happen, and the politics of that, I think, is just impossible to get away from very often.
So we're okay as long as it's not political. Which, now I'm going to come to you, Sir Ian, if that's okay, to talk about things that are possibly political. We are awash in data. I'm not sure exactly when data became big, but I think it was somewhere around the time that I became old. I mean, in the past 15 or 20 years or so. But we've got big data and we've got big challenges. If we think about COVID, the climate or biodiversity crisis that we're facing, Brexit and its impacts, we've got loads of data, and yet we still seem to disagree almost viscerally on what the evidence actually says. And you know I've switched from data to evidence. And what I'm wondering here is whether you could comment on how you think policymakers are converting data to evidence, and how these big shifts in environmental policy, in Brexit, in COVID, are affecting that.
Sure. First, can I just apologise on behalf of Northern Rail for my arrival, and I'm trusting that their delay repay scheme is working pretty efficiently. But to answer your question, I mean, look, I've been at the interface of data and policy for the last 45 years. First, as an academic, working in teams with policymakers, now in a different role in government. And for me, the issues haven't really changed. Yes, the size of the data sets perhaps are bigger, but the fact is, from where I come from, and people may disagree, that typically if you put, let's just take economists, if you put 5 economists together looking at the same data, then you're likely to get 5 different views. And I've had some absolutely brilliant and magnificently robust discussions, arguments, call them what you like, over my career, with people as to what the evidence really does say. And that's incredibly important, that we do not just say somehow there is one answer to any question. There is almost, you know, there are occasionally one answer, I take that point. But I do think that most of the time there is a discussion, and that discussion needs to take place. Now, to move from there to the policy, the first thing I would say is that, therefore, it is incredibly important that policymakers and, I'll use the word analysts, but whoever is producing the evidence, are working together from day zero. Every time that I have seen decent policy, which is evidence-based, where that evidence comes from data, however that is quantitative or qualitative data, it has involved, from day zero, potential beneficiaries in the work, policy makers in the work, and analysts in the work. And some of the work that I really have enjoyed the most has been when my analysis has been absolutely iteratively informed by the potential beneficiaries, by the policymakers, and working together. And so if I would argue, and I would argue that during the recent pandemic, I think there has been an enormous amount of successful use of data and to have those discussions, which has led to the data informing policy, I believe, extremely well. But it was incredibly important that the range of those debates were heard, and that I argued on a number of occasions that the policymakers had to hear the debates in order to be able to make good policy. And that really does then come down, again, in this case, to where I come from, statisticians, economists, analysts, being able to communicate really super well. How many times people in this room been with someone and they say, right, what does your analysis say? And they say, beta equals 4.2. And, oh my God, you know, I cry. You know, we have to really be very, very, very good at interpreting our data. And to come back to, finally, your point about, yes, we have unbelievable amounts of data. We can link data, which enable us to do things that I could only dream of when I was analysis. But we shouldn't just be going out there, I would submit, and saying, well, we've got loads of data here, let's just see what the data say. Fundamentally, analysis, in my view, needs to be grounded in theory. It needs to be based on the answering of real questions. I have said, and I would say, at the beginning of the pandemic in government, loads and loads of data were flying from everywhere. And I think some of us felt there was a bit of a data deluge. A lot of work was done to move that deluge into what are the questions we are really trying to answer, and how do we go about analysing them? Do we have data which answers those questions? If we don't have data that answers those questions, let us get some data. And that's led to us at the Office for National Statistics actually embedding people in different parts of government to be able to work to get the questions. And some of the work that the government, I think, has really excellently done recently around labour force has been the product of policymakers and analysts working together, not only to use the data that exist, but also to go and get more data to answer the questions when they don't exist. I'll stop.
Excellent. Well, you've set us up very nicely for me to bring in Sarah Connor from the Financial Times. We've interacted because I've followed your work in the FT for quite some time, and I've always enjoyed it. In my line of work, we are searching for signal in the data. We're looking for the needle in the haystack, and you have written quite eloquently, movingly, about how there's a lack of trust and a lack of understanding on behalf of politicians and on the public's behalf in those politicians and using that data. How do we get around the larger haystacks, which offer a ripe ground for sort of obfuscation and propaganda and confusion and misinformation, to give that signal?
That's a really good question. I mean, so Ian, you talked about, your job being sitting at that interface between sort of data and policy, and I suppose as a journalist, I sit at the interface between data and the public. And we haven't really talked much about the public yet, but the public is who policy is normally being done for or being done to. And so whether or not they understand what the data that fed into that policy means, whether they trust it, whether they think it was, produced in good faith, I think is really important and sometimes gets a bit lost. And yeah, I mean, the ONS with ESCO has done some really good detailed work on what the public does understand about, particularly about economic statistics. And, you know, the findings are really quite sobering in that, you know, vast numbers of people have no idea what a lot of the terms mean that economists use all the time. And not just economists, you know, we as journalists are kind of culpable here too, because I think we often assume more knowledge than actually exists. So, you know, most people don't know what GDP means. You know, we often talk about real terms, you know, real terms wages versus nominal wages. No one knows what real terms means. You know, that's utterly meaningless. And when people hear it, they think it's some kind of like trick, you know, that someone is trying to manipulate something, but they don't really know why. I mean, this is what the findings were from a whole series of focus groups that people did. And Andy Haldane in the past has talked about this sort of twin deficit in economics. There's a sort of deficit of understanding and a deficit of trust. And I think those two go hand in hand. So, I mean, I have a statistic I thought was quite telling because, I mean, clearly this has probably always been a problem, but you might think that as data has got better and people have thought more about communicating data, you might think the problem had got better, but it doesn't look like it. So in a big survey in 2019, 40% of people said they were finding it harder to understand economics when it came to thinking about how to vote, how to understand issues like Brexit. And only 14% said it had got easier over time. So I think that suggests that something is going a bit awry here, that even though we have more data, we have wonderful ways of visualizing data. You know, we've made so much headway. And I think, you know, at the Financial Times where I work, the stuff that we do now with data and with visualizing it is wonderful, but clearly there's still some kind of lost in translation things happening. And, you know, to think about my own profession, I noticed a couple of months ago, it was the daily labour market data on, had come out from the ONS. And I looked just at the headlines, and, you know, this will give you an example. So Bloomberg's headline from that data was, UK wages rising at near record pace. The Guardian's headline was, real terms UK pay fell at fastest rate for 20 years. Okay, and like both of those headlines were accurate. Clearly one was talking about nominal pay and the other one was talking about pay after inflation. But you can see that as a member of the public, if you think what's happening with wages and you Google it, and these are the first two headlines you see, you're just going to throw your hands up and think, you know, what on earth's going on? I can't trust any of this. Everyone's got their own political agenda. So I think this is a problem. I mean, there are things that can be done, and I think people are trying to do to make it better. I think the first thing is that I don't think it's about dumbing down. Like a lot of the work that's been done suggests that people actually have quite an acute understanding of the economy in terms of how it actually works and why it matters to them. It's the terminology, the language is just often just really divorced. So just changing the language, also giving people more information about how the data gets collected has been shown to really improve trust in it. So, you know, the ONS has tried presenting data to people in different ways. They'll have sort of 6 different ways of presenting it, give it to different people, and then they'll test both their understanding of that data and their trust in that data. And it looks as if using more everyday language, but also having boxes that explain, okay, this is what the labour market survey is. You know, we're not measuring how many people are on benefits. This is, you know, we're asking various people, et cetera, can be quite helpful. So I think, you know, there are definitely things that can be done. But the final thing I would say is that I don't think we should sort of mistake this mistrust and suspicion and lack of understanding with a lack of interest. You know, I think, you know, precisely the opposite. I have friends at the BBC who say that stories about the economy are always incredibly well read. You know, there is a huge hunger from people to understand what's happening and to understand data. You know, so one of my colleagues, John Byrne-Murdoch, who probably a lot of you follow on Twitter, you know, he produced these wonderful threads of charts during COVID, trying to explain to people what was happening. And, you know, the wider public absolutely, he became like a kind of superstar within the FT. Like friends of mine who have no interest in the Financial Times would say to me, do you know this guy called John? He's making amazing charts. So I think, you know, there is a real sort of hunger for data that people feel that they can trust and that helps them understand the world better, but I don't think we're necessarily there yet.
Yes, I mean, you've both touched, Ian and Sarah, you've both touched on communications. Ian, did you
I suppose
want to come in?
I completely agree with what you've said. I just wanted to make one point. I did say that I think policy should be made but through the interface not just of policy and analysts, but potential beneficiaries. And that is absolute in every piece of decent work that I've done. I'd like to think most things I've done are decent, to be honest, but has always involved the potential beneficiaries. And the second point I want to make very quickly, which I completely agree with what you've said, is that you shouldn't think that you dumb down. I think during the pandemic, the daily press conferences produced data all the time. And at the beginning, I would have to say that I think many people, including myself, thought that perhaps the quality of the presentations wasn't as good as it should be. And so ONS embedded a team into Number 10's communications to really work on that. Now, at the end of the day, the understanding and the feedback from the public got better, but I would have to say the complexity of the graphs also got higher because we were explaining better. And I do think that we should not at any time try to dumb down, but we should maximize the explanation, which is what John does so well.
And if I could just add, I absolutely concur. And just on this point of the public, I think in this idea of a data deluge, there is also something about what do we pay attention to. So, you know, there is a filtering process that the newspapers, the broadcast media, and to an extent the government also provide in saying this is what matters from this data. And so, you know, the headline is GDP, but in the Labour Force survey, as you say, you know, to Bloomberg or whoever, it's going to be the nominal wages, and to Guardian, they're choosing a different thing to highlight. And I think it's understanding what that means to people's lives, because you know, I'll never forget one of those moments back in 2016 in one of the Brexit debates where an audience member kind of responded to somebody making a point about GDP, saying, well, that's your GDP. And you know, at the end of the day, if that's what is being said to be the most important thing, but it doesn't track with people feeling that their life is getting better, they can be being told that this data means that the economy is doing really well and things are great and rosy. I mean, you know, hands up, I confess, in the coalition government, you know, we always used the how many more people were in work statistic because that was one of the success stories, but it didn't necessarily tell you whether there were good jobs, what the security was. So, you know, the what is actually being chosen as the data point, when that doesn't connect with people's lived experiences, and I think, you know, GDP tells us a lot of good information, it's a helpful statistic, but it certainly doesn't tell us everything about whether people's lives are getting better, and we fall into massive problems if we assume that it does, and we don't pay enough attention to the other indicators that will actually tell us what are the things that people care about. And in many cases, as we learned in the pandemic, those aren't even necessarily economic statistics. And I think just one example that I think really highlights that, in that decision-making in the early days of the pandemic, you know, there was a lot of focus on the impact on the economy, on output, on jobs, and so on. But one of the earliest changes that was made to the lockdown rules was actually to enable households to bubble where you had somebody living on their own. I mean, my mum was on her own. She went 88 days without touching another human being. The change, and you know, there was millions of others like her in the country, and the change to be able to enable somebody living on their own to hug somebody else, you know, you can't necessarily put a price on that, but we all really recognised that there was something incredibly important there. And so the role of politics is also about how do you actually make some of these judgments, and how do you make sure that you are in the round making the right decisions and putting the emphasis on the things that matter the most, some of which will be environmental data and statistics, but others will be different things.
This is all very interesting. Mike mentioned, as we started off the day, the Wealth Economy Project, which I've been lucky enough to be a part of since its inception. And in that work, we often talk about, well, what kind of assets do we have to invest in order to deliver a prosperous, high well-being, nature-positive economy into the future? And we speak about environmental assets and physical infrastructure and human capital and health. But one of the things that is often overlooked when we speak about government investment, Ian, is the statistical infrastructure and the statistical agencies themselves. And so what I'd like you to comment on is, are our statistical agencies sufficiently resourced? And what are the rate-limiting factors? What constraints could we remove to unleash more power from this data?
I think it's first saying that in the first place that government data doesn't exist only in national statistical institutes. Certainly the ONS is able to do an enormous amount, and we negotiate firmly with our colleagues at the Treasury, as all government departments do, around what we could do for more, but we need to recognise the fiscally constrained time that we're in. But the one thing that I think could happen better, and yet it is improving greatly, is the sharing of data between government departments. So the Office for National Statistics is just in a public beta now on something called the Integrated Data Service, which the vision is to enable large amounts of government data from different places to be brought together, to be organised in a way that they can simply be linked by analysts, and then absolutely ethically and privacy constrained, wonderful work can go on. But that does require, and this is where I think we have a real opportunity, the sharing of government data, but not only government data, I would also argue the sharing of data from many, if you like, academic sources. Colleagues in this room may have used some of the brilliant birth cohort data that I think is a jewel in the crown of the UK data resource. And having those data to be able to be linked in to many other sets of data, for example, large amounts of educational data linking into income data and benefits data, seems to me to give unbelievable opportunities, because those data, in addition to, if you like, the factual data that come with an administrative area, have attitudes and other things that I think are so important. So I do think that we're at a moment in time where linking data and bringing data together will enable us to do so much more than we are doing at the moment. Obviously, ethically, obviously, privacy done. And I should also add that I do think that there is an enormous opportunity to bring in private sector data to that world as well. And we've had enormous success in working with colleagues in the private sector to bring data in for all kinds of reasons, and that has been a thrill as well.
Well, it's good for me to know, because that was actually the next question. At least I'm on the right track. So we've spoken quite a bit about government data and sharing data across government, and we've spoken about the public and the government sectors. I'm very interested in how we can engage the private sector, carrot or stick, to be sharing data for the public good as well. So you've just mentioned this, but Joe, you've got experience in business innovation skills in that ministry, working with private sector. What can we say about how we get access to that, to use it for the public good?
Yeah, I mean, I think it hugely varies across different sectors and for what purpose. And I think there's some areas where that kind of collaboration and cooperation happens well. I also think of a couple of experiences that I had. There was one which was around the extractive industries transparency initiative and trying to get agreement from major oil and gas companies to publish data, and which was challenging at times, I would certainly say. And then another one which was on gender pay gap reporting, and we agreed as a coalition compromise to try a voluntary approach on gender pay gap reporting, which let's just say there was a lot of nice glossary reports produced, but 5 companies produced actual published data on their gender pay gap, and that was why I was delighted that we were able to prove that actually sometimes you do need to regulate and you need to require a standard format for the data so that everybody is publishing it and it can be properly compared between different companies. And I mean, I think if the data is potentially self-critical, it's going to be very difficult to get the private sector to publish voluntarily. And I think the government has a very important role to play in also producing or creating a level playing field. And so where information is very important, and we see the same in sort of climate disclosures now, there needs to be standards that are set. If you leave it to be defined by people having a pick and mix approach to which statistics they're going to publish, then you're going to get something which is not particularly helpful and is very much PR driven. So, I mean, of course, you can work with industry to help to identify what can be collected, what can be done to help the collection of that data, make sure that it's meaningful and robust and hopefully useful for the industries as well. But I think that standardization really does call for government intervention.
I think you've just described ESG,
Yeah.
ad hoc and not particularly helpful, and desperately in need of some regulation to help set some standards here.
Absolutely. Well, we wouldn't let businesses decide what information to just stick in their company accounts, right? We see something that's important, that we need that information, so you set a standard, and we absolutely need that on other big important issues.
Yeah, I think I'd just add that I think that question over using private company data sets maybe applies to academics as well. So, there are some companies like Uber is a good example, who have kind of collaborated with some big name economists in the US where they've given them access to, and Uber has extraordinary data, right, that would be, truly fascinating for all kinds of questions to do with the labour market. But there's always a bit of a sort of question mark when I read the outputs that those economists have come up with. There's always a bit of a question mark in my mind as to, to what extent can I trust these findings? To what extent was the data that they were supplied shaped by Uber's kind of PR priorities? So, I think that must be a very difficult challenge for academics, that clearly you want to get access to valuable data sets that aren't already in the public domain, but then at the same time, what compromises are you making in exchange?
Which is why I would argue very strongly, and I'm massively in favour of open science. Your data if you're going to publish something, the data have to be available to be reproduced. It's as simple as that.
And they never are in these studies.
Well, I can't speak to those studies, but I can speak to many places. I can't remember there's an article in Nature which I think talks to a number of, I know it talks to a number of journals, of economics journals, and I think a third of the randomized controlled trials reported in these journals had not been able to be reproduced. Now, there are really good reasons for that, which are sometimes due to context and all kinds of things, but I think it is really super important that we recognize that. I just wanted to say, you talked about carrots and sticks. Certainly, in terms of I agree with everything Joe said, 100%, because standards are so important. But actually, access to the data, we have, in some ways, the stick because we've got the Digital Economy Act, which at one level says, we can go in and say we require these data. Now, the bottom line is, if you do that, then people will most of the time stall in every way possible. So therefore, we found it much better to work with colleagues and to make it very clear how those data are going to be used, why it's in the public interest. And the bottom line is, for me, everything, only do it if it's in the public interest. If it's in the public interest that these data are available and they can then be made available in a way which manifestly delivers public good, then our experience is that so long as you work carefully with private sector companies, access to data is perfectly possible. And you build trust over time. And building that trust is absolutely critical. So actually having to use the stick is something you don't actually ever have to do.
A good example of that might be the ONS's been publishing Pret data, hasn't it, from
Yes.
Pret coffee shops?
Yes.
Which is, really useful sort of indicator. I mean, sure, it's one of your sort of
And
bits of straw in the haystack, but I think it still tells you something. And it's interesting that you persuaded Pret, that the ONS persuaded Pret to do that.
And also some of the card companies have been absolutely great. A lot of work to understand the privacy and everything like that, but actually understanding what the consumer has been doing and being able to publish that has, I think, been good. And we are intending, we've just brought into inflation calculation real train prices, which has been quite hard. And we are intending, and there are colleagues in this room who've been helping us enormously, to bring into inflation calculations scanner data from the major supermarkets, as opposed to people with clipboards going around. The things that we can do with those data go well beyond producing a monthly inflation statistic, and that was one of the things. I mean, you mentioned ESCO, the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence, brilliantly led by Rebecca Riley. We see that partnership as being really important in maximising the use of those data.
Excellent. I mean, we could go on the rest of the day, but I do...
Hours, actually.
I do want to open it up to our audience, both here in the room and online around the world. I happen to know that we have some from the United States, South Africa, and at least one from Japan who's told me he's logging in for this. So if we get questions online, I'd like to bring them. But we'll start here in the room. So we've got, I'll do three at a time. So there's one in the very back toilet, close to where you are.
Do you want me to go ahead? Okay. Andrea Westall, I just want to go back to the previous session, because we were talking there about how you really start to get action happening at more local and regional levels. And I was involved in the early days when the SDGs started, Sustainable Development Goals, looking at whether or not that data was disaggregated enough to know whether or not it was actually, what was happening at local level. And it wasn't, and there were some really good discussions with ONS about where and what it could be done to really start to get this data to work at that level and get better understanding. But it's not just that, it's also the models that are then created that make it easier for policymakers to be able to use that in order to look at interventions. So I was chairing a UKRI competition which was looking at some of these examples. One was done on food economies in local areas. And as a policymaker, it was remarkable just seeing how this was being visualised, made it so much easier to start to think about where interventions could be. And I think there's something about more, it's a question for all of you really, is like, how can we get that data and those models down to the level which are really needed to start to shift some of the challenges that we've heard earlier?
Okay, excellent. So there's another question here.
Hi, sorry, my name is Abisola, and I currently work as Special Policy Advisor to the Chief Executive at the Care Quality Commission. But I have two questions. My first question goes to my current role. So we've talked about data, and Professor Ian spoke about sharing data across public bodies and the potential that wields. And I'm just going to ask about cybersecurity. How prepared is the public sector to actually deal with huge data breaches and cyber attacks in the context, that geopolitical context of geopolitical hostility that we talked about in the first session? I think data is also being viewed as a weapon these days. So is the public sector actually ready? When you put all that data together in one place, are you ready to actually keep that secure, especially as we move towards a more digitized world? The second question goes to my former role. So previously, I used to work with the United Nations, several UN agencies, and it felt like a silver bullet the moment we started to talk about context-driven policy. So policy work that is homegrown, involves the countries that we're working with, and really, really works through their own methods and their own styles. But one of my frustrations, which is one of the reasons why I left the UN system as a whole was because it wasn't working, not in my opinion anyway. So we're co-producing the work, we're really hearing the voices of people, but in the end, we're still dealing with the same problems year after year, 5-year frameworks, 4-year policy strategies, but Nigeria would come back with the same problems and we'd draft another document and would churn money into it. So I just wonder how you would deal with that kind of frustration as a policymaker. Do you get to any point where you'd actually say, no, you know what, I'm going to use my technical skills, my understanding of what would work or what would work better, rather than what the context is really telling me? That's just a devil's advocate
Thank you.
question.
So we've got 2 questions from you here, one on cybersecurity, one on co-production and the obstacles there. I think, so now we've got 3. We've got one on national models and national data bringing down to local decision-making. We've got one on cybersecurity and whether the public sector is ready. That's got a personal interest for me. I was a patient at the hospital when there was a cyber attack on the NHS, and the computer system for mixing up chemotherapeutic drugs collapsed. And so the nurses all had to do this by hand, and they did so very well, but this is a really important concern. And we've got a question about, okay, co-production sounds good, it's hard to do in practice. How do we get past this? So who wants to take these?
Well, can I just start on the first 2 of those
Sure.
questions, if I may, and others can come in? I totally agree with the colleague at the back, I'm sorry I didn't get your name, about the fact that local level data are critically important. What I worry about is when you take one national model and say we'll just put it down, because things are different in different regions. So that's why the ONS has a subnational data strategy where, for example, you may have seen we released GVA a couple of weeks ago down to areas of around 400 to 1,500 people right across England, with the idea being that you can then bring them together to build your own geographies. But also, we have been working right across the regions. We now have ONS statisticians in different regions. We've called it ONS Local, to be working with local policymakers to bring local data for local decisions. Local policymakers making local decisions with local data. I think it's incredibly important. You can still cascade things down from the national if you wish to, but when we've been going around talking to local leaders enormously, they've got different issues they want to raise, they've got different issues, and indeed the models look different. And so I think you really do need to build models which have the ability to be different for different regions. And I've said that for a very long time. And we'd be delighted to work with you in that arena. On cybersecurity, just to make one point, if I may, firstly, when I talk about linking data, I don't talk about data lakes. The way we do things now is through APIs, and data stay in different places. And so that does not, in saying that, minimize the threat of cybersecurity. It's enormous, and we would be foolish, it seems to me, if we did not have it right at the top of our risk registers and doing everything that we can to make sure for ONS that we work with partners, for example, across government to ensure that we're doing everything that we can and that we are keeping public data as absolutely safe as it is possible to do so.
I think I remember seeing not that long ago a head of cybersecurity job posting at the Treasury with a salary range of about £50,000 for the head of cybersecurity for G7. So yes, there's lots of work being done, but sometimes we just get these signals wrong. That's incredibly skilled, high-value work. Needs to be invested in, I think. I'm going to bring some questions in from online, and then I'll come to this side of the room. So this one I'd like to go to Sarah and Joe, if you may. We've got a data skills gap in the UK, and when we combine a lack of data skills with an awful lot of data, are we just, creating a lot of dangerous opportunities for mixed messages, poorly used data, poorly analyzed, badly communicated? How do we address this?
I mean, it definitely is a real challenge, and I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why it's important that governments have a skills strategy that they can identify what are the gaps likely to be, what are the professions that are going to be needed, but also things move incredibly quickly. So there was a time maybe 15 years ago or something when coding was seen as the big thing, that everybody needed to learn to code. And if you see the development of the AI recently, then actually probably writing code is not going to be the key skill, an understanding of it, absolutely. So it's not even always easy to predict, but I mean, clearly data skills is a problem. I mean, I would even say that, and it perhaps goes to the point about the cybersecurity point of the Treasury, even within our politics. I mean, how many elected representatives and have got the literacy needed in these issues, and what are the opportunities, rather than just kind of saying, oh well, they don't, but what are the opportunities to learn while actually doing that job? It's not as if there's a plethora of opportunities to do that within the parliamentary system at the moment. So I think these are real issues to look at. If I can just pick up on a couple of points that Axola and Andrea made, just on that co-production point, I think there is often a frustration as a policymaker that you can try to figure out what you want to happen, but the real genius is in how it's going to happen, and that's where so many good policies fail or fall short. Or just take a long time. I mean, universal credit would be a good example. I mean, absolutely the right policy to try to simplify the system and get rid of perverse incentives. But my goodness, it's difficult to do the transitions, particularly at a time when the finance wasn't put into it. And you'll see that replicated in so many different ways. So, I mean, I don't know the specifics where the kind of co-production model fell down in the experiences you had. But, I mean, I think sometimes things are just very hard to do. I mean, I think as Jean-Claude Juncker said, it's all very well to know we know what we want to do. We just don't know how to get elected having done it. And so the important part of co-production is, at the end of the day, policy implementation does rely on consent. It does rely on buy-in, and there needs to be ways of doing that. And I think that's one of the most important elements of co-production, but it's not the only way to achieve that end. And then just finally to Andrea's point about local and regional data, I think it's so important and so powerful. One of the organisations we support is the Donut Economics Action Lab, led by Kate Rayworth. Many of you will know Kate and her book Donut Economics. And seeing the visualizations of the donut, not just on a kind of global level, but they are able to do country donuts, and then even working with cities like Amsterdam to say, what does this look like on a city level? That's one of the ways in which you can start to solve that communication gap issue for people to be able to understand, how does this affect their lives? Does this tally with their experiences? So I think making it more granular and breaking it down, and ideally with good visualization and communication, so it's not just a massive table of numbers, is really important for putting it to good use.
I think I'll just add on that point that, I mean, as a journalist, having access to really good regional and local data is fabulous, because it means that if you're interested in a particular problem, you can figure out where is this problem most acute, or where is this problem growing the fastest, and then you can go there, and then you can do the kind of qualitative, like shoe leather stuff to figure out the why, which is often what the data doesn't tell you. And that's never going to be a kind of a sort of gold standard, but I think it's incredibly useful, and without it, you can't really get very far. But I would just say that sometimes with taking the economic data down to a granular level, you can sort of end up with things that are a bit meaningless or a bit misleading. So, you mentioned that GVA data that went to very fine level. I think it was the GVA data, or I might be misremembering it was a different data set, but something recently from the ONS came out that suggested that the most productive place in the whole country is Macclesfield. Now, I grew up near Macclesfield, and it does not scream to me that it is the most highly productive, prosperous place in the country. And, I sort of scratched my head and thought about it, and I thought it's probably because there's an AstraZeneca factory there. So, you have to sometimes think about whether the data is telling people the things that they might think that it's telling them.
And at local level, that's so incredibly important. But it can also add to the value. Let's imagine that local area. Why is it? Well, now we know. Question is that transferable to other areas that we would like to impact on? I think the data almost never tell you all the answer, but they point you in the direction of where you might go next.
Very good.
Which is why we need journalists.
I think I'll come back to this side of the room. So there's a question, is that Yamini?
Thanks for the really interesting talk. My name's Yamini. I had the pleasure of starting my career at the Bennett Institute, and I currently work at the Greater London Authority, where we are developing a measure of well-being and sustainability for London. So very much at this kind of interface between the policy and the data, but actually what we're finding at the moment, kind of working in this strange space of being the GLA as this kind of strategic body for London, and then kind of having to work with the devolved authorities as well, is that actually there's not enough data, or there's not data that's useful for the kind of challenges that the mayor wants to address, particularly around kind of London's inequalities. It's a bit of a scale issue, but it's also an issue of having these independent authorities having no incentive to share data. So I just wonder how we can sell this idea that we need to be sharing data, particularly given how kind of resource constrained authorities are, and given the fact that they don't want to be put in a league table and come out kind of ranking at the bottom of it.
Excellent, thank you. There's a question right here, 3 or 4 rows back, yeah. And then I'm going to come to Mark. No, not coming to Mark.
Thank you. Adam Price, leader of Plaid Cymru. How can data help policymakers and politicians generate the kind of radical, bold new thinking that was touched upon in the last session? So classically, evidence-based policymaking tends to be applied to choosing between existing policy options. But what happens if you're trying to generate entirely new ideas for which, almost by definition, there is no evidence? How could data help in creating that sort of culture of policy experimentalism, policy innovation, and even help change the culture of politics to embrace, as a necessary part of the learning process, failure, which, as Joe knows, is something that's anathema in our conventional political culture?
Very good question. And we have one just behind you from Teresa.
Thanks very much. Teresa Marte, behavioural scientist, Cambridge. Partly it links, I think, to the last question, which is about the role of policy makers and policy making in generating evidence. So we've talked quite a lot about linking data and sharing data to inform policy making and the analysts working closely with the policy makers. There's a gap, a gaping chasm, some of us would call it, between the rollout of a policy and the generation of data to monitor it in real time, as well as to evaluate it. NAO drew attention to that in their report in 2021, where they found that only 8% of over £400 billion worth of spending had any evaluation plan built into it. And as Ian will probably remember during COVID, SAGE would often give advice that a policy that was being suggested would have a robust evaluation built into it, and too often that didn't happen. So I'd be keen to hear from the panelists about the importance of policy makers actually generating the evidence so that it's being used in a circular fashion. Thanks.
Excellent, another great set of questions. So, Ian, I'm going to come to you on the how to share data. You said it's important that we share data, but it's challenging to do so. So, Yamini wants to know how.
Yeah, the first problem, which you did mention, which is you mentioned about the devolved. Of course, we don't have where things rightly are devolved, then the data aren't always collected to the same standards. And that was paramount in some of the issues that we faced in the pandemic, and I could point to another 100 issues. So the first thing is having an agreement that you wish to share data, then you have to be collecting data to similar standards, the first point. Second point, the example that you talked to, which I think is a really, really super good one, is well-being. And actually, we don't collect enough data, in my view, in a wide range of areas which impact on well-being. But of course, it's a contested space as to how you measure well-being in the first place. So at the Office for National Statistics, we're working with the Carnegie Foundation to really identify some metrics of well-being, which we can then build into our program, which we call Beyond GDP. We're saying, I mean, GDP's been mentioned before, but I mean, it was the former American presidential candidate, the late Bobby Kennedy, who famously said, I paraphrase, GDP measures everything except that which is useful, or which is relevant or useful. So actually building well-being is something that we're very committed to, but we recognize the real challenges of getting comparable data across a wide range of places, and that's something that is high on our agenda. We don't have the answers yet, but it would be great to work with you and talk about it. And the third area, which is absolutely profound, that you mentioned, is the whole point about league tables. As soon as you collect data across, shall we say, local authorities, school league tables, then however you look at it, school league tables, definition, it's a league table, you know? And the late Harvey Goldstein used to rail, rightly in my view, against those tables because they weren't measuring schools, they were measuring many other things. And so I do think there is a real argument to producing data, but not necessarily producing it and publishing league tables, but enabling people to know where they sit and how they compare. And I think that can impact positively on policy. Can I just come to also the second point on radical policy making? I do think radical policy making is absolutely critical. You look to see whether you've got the data. You may have some data that impacts on that radical thinking. Don't look, I would argue, don't look to analysts too much to come out with the policy making for you. Talk with them about what the data might say. You might want to trial things. Teresa talked a little bit about trialing. Let's get some really good trials going in policy making at a small scale. Let's build, and they don't have to be long-term massive trials. We can build trials in. Let's get feedback loops. And sometimes, you know, policymakers, and I can point to policymakers who, in my opinion, have been bold at sometimes and have gone for things. Okay, but let's make sure, and agree totally with Teresa, let's make sure that we've got proper evaluation strategies in with feedback loops so that we can be saying, gosh, this was just such a brilliant idea, but wouldn't it have been even more brilliant with a bit of a tweak? And we've got the evidence then to tweak it, and to use Teresa's absolutely fine point, the policymakers generating the data.
So on that point of policymakers generating data, Joe, do you want to?
Well, I mean, I'm fascinated by Adam's question and spent a lot of time thinking about this issue now, because, and going back to the discussion in the previous panel, perhaps just in terms of setting the scene, I think there's sometimes an assumption that, you know, we had the financial crisis and then we've had, you know, the disruption of Brexit and the pandemic and then the invasion of Ukraine and all the energy and cost of living crisis. And there's an understandable desire for things to just settle down and go back to how they were. You know, I grew up, I was a teenager in the 1990s. It was that period between the fall of the Berlin Wall and 9/11. There was a stability. And I think we kind of got used to a kind of feeling that stability was the norm. I'm not actually convinced it is the norm when you look at history. And I certainly think when you consider the different elements at play, I think it would be a folly to consider that stability was going to be what we are facing in the decades to come, particularly with the suite of ecological problems that we are facing. Yes, climate, and also, by the way, we focus so much on climate, which is important, and of course, if you look at the planetary boundaries and the science about where we are overshooting the capacity of the planet, climate is not even where we are overshooting the most. It's not even in the top 3. So there are many other issues that we deeply need to be paying attention to as well, rather than think, well, we'll solve climate and then we'll come to, mass extinctions and soil quality and all these other things. And I think, so one of the limitations of data, well, it's 2 limitations. One is, almost by definition, it tends to be a bit backward-facing. It tends to show you where you've come from. It doesn't necessarily show you where you are going and where you need to go. And we find that, in the pandemic, we got very good at real-time data, and obviously getting that lag down was incredibly important to understanding where we were right now, because when you're dealing with an exponential factor, you don't want a week's lag in the data. So there's a kind of time horizon thing that it tells you about how things were, not things which are rapidly changing and are a different set of scenarios. And then also, I think, in politics in particular, it gets used as a barrier. It gets used as a way to end an argument and to say, you can't do that. So in the late 90s, you can't introduce a minimum wage because there'll be massive unemployment, and the data is really clear on that. And actually, that wasn't the experience that we had. It was a bold policy. It was the right policy. It was right of the government to press ahead with it. But if they just looked at all of the data, you might have actually had a different result. So I think you need that nuance that Sirian was talking about earlier to understand that data doesn't give you all of the hard and fast answers. It definitely points you to good questions, and it can help to inform your discussion, but that needs to be a more nuanced discussion. And just to underline that point about where we're going, I understand that the climate models done by William Nordhaus have been updated very recently, and they've now shown that actually the likely climate damage to the economy is far in excess of what his initial models shown, and it's great that he's updated this. But I have to say, they are now saying that in a 6 degrees warming world that the hit to GDP will be 12%. At 6 degrees, the science says that the only place that we will be able to have agriculture in any way, shape or form will be at either pole of the planet. There will be huge parts of the world that are uninhabitable by people being out of doors, right? And the idea that that's just a 12% hit, I know 12% hit's quite a lot, but there's something that just doesn't connect. And I think it's that you're talking about a world that is so different to what we've experienced that a data model that's based on now just doesn't necessarily translate. So I think it's a very salient point that you're asking here, Adam, about how do we get that data and evidence to understand the world as it is rapidly changing in areas where it is rapidly changing. I think one thing data can do is to show the failures of the existing system, because sometimes I feel like collectively we're sleepwalking and we think that everything's just going to be fine. And actually, when you start to look at the scientific data, it is just quite terrifying. And yet that isn't reflected in our national public debate, because that's uncomfortable, and then that gets ridiculed because it doesn't fit with the data models that have necessarily been assumed to be the case before. So I think that's one way that data can help us to challenge the status quo.
Just because of the clock,
Absolutely.
but I completely agree on the challenges of using past data describing climate and economic output to forecast anything into the future. But that brings me to, I'd like to ask you, Sarah, for the final word before we move into something slightly different. If we can't just rely on backwards-looking data to tell us how to make progress in the future, perhaps there's an important role for communication and narrative to try and explain, well, how can we use this to try and design a more prosperous future? And as the journalist on the panel, perhaps you could comment on this.
I sometimes am given feedback by people that some of the pieces I write are maybe a bit gloomy, too many pieces about what's going wrong and not enough pieces about, what could be done differently, or, you know, let's have some positive ideas for how to fix things. And I find this quite a challenge because, you know, I'm not a policymaker, I'm a journalist. My job is to sort of find out what's going on in the world. But that said, I mean, and I think this goes a little bit to your point, is sometimes I think policymakers in a kind of national or regional context can become quite sort of insular, and you sort of think, you know, this would be a big step into the unknown, we've never done it before, we don't know what the data says. But actually, sometimes if you lift your sights and look at what happens in other countries or what other countries are doing, it can be incredibly informative and kind of liberating. And that's sort of what I've started to do a bit in my column, is more of, hey, you know, Spain's got a massive problem with precarious work. They've just brought in this huge reform, and the number of people on temporary contracts has plunged by 60%. You know, that's really interesting. Let's look into it. How did they do it? What were the intended and unintended consequences? You know, you talked about the minimum wage, which is another one. You know, in the US, there's still great resistance to any notion of kind of raising the federal minimum wage above whatever kind of ridiculous sum it is now, $5 an hour or something. And people are still having that argument, saying, oh, it will cause mass unemployment. But, you know, raise your sights. You know, most countries in the world have massively increased the minimum wage, and all the evidence shows that, so far at least, at the level at which they've done it, it hasn't caused mass unemployment. And so sometimes that can be another way of thinking about it. It's just seeing what other countries are doing. You know, New Zealand, having spent decades deregulating their labour market, is trying to bring in sectoral collective bargaining for the 21st century. Really interesting, might work, might not work, but we should probably pay attention, right? Because that's pretty much what Labour's put in its manifesto. So there's all kinds of ways in which, you know, looking beyond our shores can be useful. And it's not very easy to do. The reason I don't do it as often as I should is, you know, you don't speak the right language, you don't know who the right experts are, you don't know how to use their statistical system. So it's a bit of a challenge. But if I was a policymaker, I feel like I would probably spend quite a lot of time trying to seek out fellow policymakers in my area in different countries and just talking to them about their own experiences.
Well, thank you very much. I hate to stop the panel a few minutes early, but there is another project that I'd like to share with you, which is about communicating quantitative information in a medium, yes, Mike, through music. So this is a project that could only happen here at the Bennett, and I know that because I'm affiliated with 4 or 5 other academic institutes, and I've asked the directors, and they said they love the project, but no, nobody in their team would be permitted to spend their time on this. And it could only happen here in Churchill College, because I needed to have this particular musician to work with. There's a field of environmental science called acoustic ecology. And essentially, these natural scientists send microphones into forests, grasslands, coral reefs, and the deep ocean. And they eavesdrop on nature. And when you listen to the ecosystems, you get a sense of which species are there, how active are they, in what population numbers, what times of day are they active, what times of year are they active, how is the mating season changing. And when we analyze this data across ecosystems and around the world, it's telling us one fairly gloomy story, which is that nature is going quiet. Our interactions through the economy, our interactions on nature, are silencing nature's soundscapes. Now, I think that's quite a powerful thing, but we try as academics and as journalists to convey this quantitative information about the loss of ecosystems, the loss of nature, and the fact that this is a huge risk, and we're pushing against the planetary boundaries. And we do this with lines pointing down, and we do this with red ink on the graphs instead of green. But it doesn't resonate. Whereas music does resonate, literally, with people. And so I thought that what we would try and do is take an iconic piece of music and do to that music what we have done to nature, which is to slowly silence it and degrade it and deplete it. And maybe that would be a way of communicating this quantitative information to a different kind of audience through a different medium. And we have done this in our world premiere of the Hebrides Redacted, our variation on Felix Mendelssohn's The Hebrides Overture, was last year at the Wilderness Festival. And we have a new piece that's coming out this year at the Wilderness Festival. I think we have queued up a little 2-minute synopsis, introductory video. And if you are interested and want to see more, in the program on, I think, page 11 or 13, there is a little QR code, which I'm told if you scan, you'll be able to bring up the full documentary. So before we go off to lunch, can we roll the tape?
For decades, scientists around the world have been listening to nature to assess the health of ecosystems. And their data tells us a single damning story. Nature is going quiet. Scientists have tried to convey this with graphs and data and charts, but the message isn't landing. We need a new way to communicate the enormity of biodiversity loss. Mendelssohn's Hebrides Overture is an iconic piece of classical music. It captures the beauty, the power, and the vitality of the sea. The Hebrides Redacted begins with Mendelssohn's original score intact. But just as humanity pulled whales from the ocean, the score is depleted over time.
That's an even shorter version than that. There is a video of this with a live performance that's available in the program. So that's going to be available to watch from your own smartphone, but also I think we have a plasma TV in the battery as well to take a look. And there is one other feature that we have today. In honor of our keynote speaker, the director of the Leverhulme Trust, we wanted to showcase some of the work that we've been doing with Professor Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Seger, who has been our visiting professor, Leverhulme visiting professor here at the Bennett Institute. And so there will be slides available, or there will be slides shown during lunch that you can take a look at some of the work that she's been doing on law and sustainability and how we can use the legal system to bring economics and science in line. With that, thank you very much.
Well done.